As many of you are probably also experiencing in this strange time, it's a great time to declutter your home. Or maybe the opposite and make a giant mess everywhere. One thing I did unearth during this cleaning was my old college duvet cover. It's quite common in the costuming community to make gowns with IKEA fabric, so I've had this in my mind for a while. The American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking has an Italian gown pattern that I think is simple enough that I can do, and it's really pretty. So with the fabric and pattern decided, here we go. Some potential roadblocks at the beginning were that I replaced this duvet cover because Millie was putting rips in it. That's my cat. And I didn't know if there was really enough fabric in a queen duvet that's only one-sided to make a whole gown. To determine if I had enough fabric, I needed to measure out what I had, which ended up being about 78 inches by 82 inches. The American Duchess book said that 90 to 120 inches was the range for the skirt width that's attached to the bodice. So I worked out I could fit 2 panels of 40 by 50 inches to make up the skirt, and that would leave me with a good chunk of fabric to cut out the bodice and the sleeves. The underskirt would have to be the stripy fabric on the back side because there wasn't enough of the floral. And when inspecting the duvet, none of the rips that were there were that serious, so I ignored them. The gridded patterns in the American Duchess book come on a scaled grid for only one size. Step 1 was to figure out the approximate measurements of the gridded pattern for the bust, waist, length, and arms. This was done by adding up the lengths across the pattern pieces. Not the most accurate way, but it will be an okay approximation. I noticed the numbers weren't so different from mine, then I remembered to account for seam allowance. I sort of arbitrarily chose new lengths for key points of the pattern to hopefully give me a guideline when drawing one out. Now it's time to actually draft out the pattern. I like to start with those guideline points, those lengths I just chose in my small drawing. Then from those guideline dots, I start drawing the approximate shape of the pattern piece. This is not an exact method, and an actual seamstress would probably have a heart attack because I'm barely measuring and I'm not using a French curve to get smooth lines. But my thinking is that this pattern is just a baseline for me to start adjusting, so any issues with it will get fixed as I keep amending the pattern time and time again. While you watch me unsuccessfully pin this pattern with one hand, this first mock-up was cut out of cheap cotton muslin, paying attention to the grain direction, which is actually important to the fit of the front of the bodice. For the first mock-up, this came out pretty great, and it made it clear where I needed to make changes. It did fit all the way around me, and the arms were pretty good, but the back gaped out a bit, which I needed to take in, and it definitely needed to be lengthened all the way around, and the front of the bodice was too low, so that also needed to be raised, and the front didn't meet up with a nice parallel overlap, which it needs to when it gets pinned together. You see how they come together at an angle. My next step is to cut out new pattern pieces with changes added, cut it out of the mock-up fabric, sew it up, and check the fit again, and then just keep repeating that until it ends up the way I want it. I numbered the pattern pieces so I didn't confuse them, with the first one being the first one I drew, the second one being the second one, and so on, so I didn't mix them up. The front of the bodice underwent the most changes of any of the pattern pieces from the first iteration to my final pattern. This is the process that I endearingly call mock-up hell, and I knocked it out in one day, which is pretty good, but you can get stuck making mock-ups that just keep getting worse or aren't changing the way you want them to, so I was very happy that I got this all done in one day. To keep Millie busy, I gave her favorite toy, a new paper bag to play with. And here is the final mock-up. I believe this is my 4th sewn together mock-up, and the fit was just how I wanted it, with the fronts overlapping in a parallel way. I just needed to raise the neckline, and I didn't think I needed to make another mock-up for that. I just noted it on my pattern for when I cut out the actual fabric. When making notes for the adjustments to my final pattern, I remembered I needed to split the back panel to make a total of 4 panels cover the back. This is optional in the book, but I think it looks better with 4. And you have to remember to add seam allowance if you cut your pattern piece like this, because I include seam allowance in my pattern pieces. When I cut out, I don't add seam allowance. To prep the fabric for cutting, it needs to be unduveted, as I call it. It took me a whole episode of Shameless to rip apart all the layers and take off all the buttons, being very careful not to rip the fabric because I would need every inch of length for those skirt panels. Then I ironed it all smooth. I've been pretty lax on ironing in the past projects, but I wanted to try to be more diligent this time, especially along those edges that had been machine folded when the duvet was made. Those are very hard to iron out. With the fabric folded in half, I cut the 2 skirt panels to save for later, 50 inches along the fabric, which I then cut down the center to make 2 separate 50-inch by 40-inch panels. So the remaining 35 or so inches folded in half was all I had left to cut out all the bodice pieces and the sleeves. I did have the pillowcases to rely on if I really needed backup fabric, but I don't think I could cut a whole sleeve out of them because they're one-piece sleeves. So I hope what's left will make the sleeves. I don't actually know yet while I'm recording this voiceover if I have enough. When laying the pattern pieces out, I made sure to leave room in between so that I could add those amendments to the patterns, like adding the extra seam allowance and raising the neckline a bit. I knew I couldn't actually construct this the way the book wanted me to, which is hand sewing everything with historical stitches. I'm not ready for that because my hand sewing is very poor and I like to work fast. So I decided to construct the garment with the machine and then hand finish it. This made an issue for the 2 boning channels. So when cutting out the lining, I had to make extra strips for the boning channels because I couldn't achieve that with the hand stitching that the book had in the construction method. When sewing these boning channels, I needed to take extra caution not to put them in the seam allowance because they need to be touching along the middle back. So my first stitches were along where the seam allowance will be, and then the next line of stitches to create the boning channel was then towards the pattern piece middle. I know that bag lining isn't correct for this period, which I did use on my red wool jacket, which is where you construct the lining separate and add it in at the end. So what I did here is flat lining, I think, which is where the fashion fabric and the lining are treated as one piece together. I think these are normally tacked together with stitches, but I just threw a few pins in, hopefully keeping them together and not shifting too much. My plan for finishing is to hand fell the seams at the end, so for now they are just left pressed open. I also wanted to mention that my lining is some lightweight cotton scraps I got out of a bin at a garage sale for about $1. Probably should have used something a bit more sturdy, but it's what I had in my stash to use, so I used it. For the curved seams along the back, you want to be very sure to avoid puckering, and you can do this by just pinning it a lot closer than you would normally do for 2 straight pieces getting pinned together, and this will help all 4 layers stay nice and even and then not pucker up on one side or the other. With the back pieces put together, I wanted to make sure the boning channels were all good, so I checked and just slipped those bones, and I'm using zip ties left over from my corset project. With all the bodice seams put together, the last step before fitting is to add the shoulder strap linings, but not the outer piece. That comes later after the sleeves are attached. And here is the fit of the bodice pinned over my stays. It is still quite low cut, but a lace tucker should help with that. Hopefully this helps you getting over your fear of scaling up a pattern. I had never done it before and was quite apprehensive working from the small gridded pattern, but taking it one step at a time wasn't so bad. Next step will be attaching the skirts, so stay tuned.